I see London, I see France. But does the U.S. have a chance? Exploding economic crises across the pond could be a preview of coming attractions here at home. First, the images from France, violent demonstrations dragging on for an 8th day, sparked in part by the French government's plan to raise the retirement age by 2 years. Meanwhile, in that country, much as in our own, European banks still reaping blockbuster profits, and the optics of special interest control of the government fairly transparent and now coming at the expense of striking workers. A third of gas stations are shut down. A quarter of flights are canceled. Garbage piling up in the streets, and truly a matter of life and death for the sick as doctors and nurses not showing up for work. Chaos unfolding because the French, having been, well, messed with long enough by their special interests, appear to be fed up. A similar spending crisis just a few hundred miles north in London. Except these cuts even deeper, the biggest in generations. Tax increases, 500,000 public sector jobs cut, billions slashed from welfare spending, and a raise in the retirement age to 66, 4 more years than the increase in France. Of course, the banksters in that country making out like bandits all the same. The difference between the land of Big Ben and, of course, France is that there's no uproar, no rioting, no gridlock. No way the French would ever take it that way. Our question, what happens when we can no longer ignore our own controlled, manipulated, extracting economy and its impact on loss of teachers, loss of judges, loss of firefighters, and the impending threat to public revenues on the tax base as a result of the screwing of the housing market in this country by our banks and our government? Let's get some perspective on the unfolding events overseas. Newsweek's Tracy McNichol is with us from Paris in London. Johann Hari, columnist for The Independent. It's a pleasure to have you both. Tracy, is this as simple as the American media would have us believe, that the French people are quite irrationally and insanely protesting over a change in the retirement age?
No. No. It's a little bit more complicated than that, and I think it's sort of there are some things that show up in the American media that isn't necessarily representative. I mean, you see the violence on television, but they make nice pictures. But the people who are really the casseurs, as they're called, the people who break things, they're so marginal. It's such a marginal part of this whole movement. 2,000 arrests out of 3 to 7 million, all told, marching in the streets in the past week. And, you know, it actually, people think that that violence in the streets is bad for Sarkozy, but it's actually bad for the movement, and it's actually something that might actually work in Sarkozy's favor. Right. Because it decredibilizes the movement. It scares away the moderates, yeah. And Sarkozy really has a sort of that law and order image. And if he's got cops dressed up, you know, as RoboCop out in the streets moving these bad guys out of the way, it actually works out, you know, sort of well for him in a way, if he can break, if the movement can break with that.
Understood. I want to bring Johann Hari in from England. Johann, how do the British people, in your view, feel about the depriving of resources of the vast majority of the population and the preservation of power for the political interests and economic interests that are so influential in Western government right now?
Well, people are quite dazed here. 64% of people at the general election this year voted for parties that said they wouldn't cut quickly and were explicitly opposed to this kind of Tea Party agenda. Nonetheless, even David Cameron, who won, said very clearly there won't be swinging cuts, we won't cut frontline services. Now they've thrown all of that to the winds. They've introduced a real kind of Tea Party wet dream, really. And there's a kind of dazed air about it. I mean, people can see what's going to happen. George Osborne, the finance minister here, the equivalent to the Secretary of State for the Treasury, said just a few years ago, look and learn from across the Irish Sea. Ireland will be our model. We're doing exactly what they did in Ireland, you know, cutting in the middle of a recession. Well, what happened in Ireland? They said they had to cut in order to please the bond market. In fact, what's happened is the worst economic collapse in Ireland's history. Indeed, one of the worst economic collapses of any developed country since the Second World War. Absolutely massive unemployment, massive rises in poverty, and they can't even pay their debts because economic growth has collapsed. And indeed, the bond market has now really turned on them because, of course, it's not in anyone's interest to have the country collapse.
Tracy, it seems much easier, though, politically, to simply cut the most vulnerable as opposed to being forced to do the actual hard work. God help anybody if he actually had to do hard work to reform the corrupt political processes that funnel extraordinary amounts of money to special groups of people, the most obvious one being the banks in both Western Europe and America. Also, we've got rigged trade with China. We've got foreign oil extractions that are going on. No government seems prepared to stand up to the actual problems and instead looks to the least represented communities that exist and cuts from them. At what point do you think the momentum changes, and how does it change from exploitation to reform and justice?
Well, it's important to keep in mind that that the French aren't against reform. They aren't against pension reform. If you ask anybody, if you ask any union leader, if you ask any party leader of the opposition, if you ask the people marching in the streets, they aren't against reform. They're against this specific reform. And the way that that Sarkozy has decided to attack the pension deficit, and the 62 figure, there are a lot of things you can do with pension reform. It can be an age thing, it can be what you pay into the system, it can be what you get out of the system, it can be a full systemic change, and people are against this specific reform, and more importantly, they're against this reformer. Sarkozy is incredibly unpopular. And a lot of things he'd think to do, maybe if someone else thought of them, it would be different. But his poll numbers are incredibly low as 26, and people feel that he favors the rich. And there's been a whole slurry of scandals this summer that sort of back that. It seemed there was resignation a little bit for this reform back in the spring, and now all of that sort of piled up in the summer, and now people are mad, and people are getting more and more mad. As time goes on, even though this reform gets closer and closer to being passed.
Johann, what could, whether it's the British government, the French government, or the impending cuts and insanity that is sure to come to our shores in the months ahead, if a governor actually wanted to solve the problems in the context of Thomas Paine, one of our founding fathers here, in a social contract, as opposed to just to cover their own ass and leave everybody else high and dry, what would be the best incentive to do that you can think of? What's the best model for why this is, while maybe a politically expedient solution, it's actually disastrous for the politicians and the people?
Well, the best model is from the history of your own country. Choose to be Franklin Roosevelt rather than Herbert Hoover. Choose to stimulate the economy, but it requires all of us to understand and explain that it is better to have a deficit than to have a depression. It is a good thing to rack up debt now, if that we repay in the good times, if the alternative is economic collapse, as it so clearly is. And, you know, below all these economic statistics, there are real human tragedies below the austerity that has just been announced in Britain. I'll give you one example, something that you've got coming your way if people do choose to give the Tea Party a licence to continue. The local council that David Cameron said he held up as his model, Hammersmith and Fulham, is a place I've reported from. And the effects there of the austerity, massive budget cuts, have been horrendous. You've got pregnant women sleeping in the park because they can't get housing. You've got old people dying because the people who were there to look after them, the state employees, to make sure they were kept clean and fed, were laid off. You've got, you know, absolutely horrifying stories. My father was made redundant in the last Conservative recession here. I remember how terrible that was for my family. Well, PricewaterhouseCoopers, a very conservative corporate group, have just said that as a result of what was announced in Britain yesterday, 1 million people are going to be directly fired, simply as the result of government employees being laid off and then the people who depend on government contracts being laid off. That doesn't include all the people who will then be laid off even more as the economy gets worse and worse. So when we discuss these things, I think it's important to explain the economics, that what they're doing is, as Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, said, economically illiterate. It's the equivalent of applying leeches to treat somebody's headache, but also that it's an absolutely unnecessary and preventable human tragedy.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. As I've watched it develop in our own country, the popularity of those who would seek to exploit the fear as opposed to acknowledge the problem is stunning. I thank both of you for sharing your perspectives with us. Tracy McNichol from Newsweek in Paris and Johann Hari from The Independent.